What would you do if the world turned its back on you, but a stranger's kindness lit the way forward? In the heart of a bustling city, where neon lights flickered and the hum of life never ceased, Margaret Ellison, a woman of 74, stood trembling outside a small diner. Her hands clutched a worn handbag, her silver hair catching the glow of the streetlights. She had lived a life of quiet dignity, raising 3 children alone after her husband's passing, always finding a way to make ends meet. But time had not been kind. Her pension barely covered rent, and tonight, hunger had driven her to the dinner place she hadn't visited in years. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of coffee and fried onions. Margaret sat at a corner booth, her hands shaking as she counted coins for a simple meal, a bowl of soup and a slice of bread. The waitress, a young woman with sharp eyes, watched her closely. When Margaret's coins fell short by $1, the manager stormed over. "We don't run a charity here," he barked, his voice cutting through the diner's chatter. "Pay up or get out." Humiliation burned in Margaret's chest as she gathered her things, the eyes of other patrons boring into her. She shuffled toward the door, her heart heavy with shame. Outside, the cold bit at her fingers. She stood under the diner's awning, unsure where to go. That's when she noticed him, a man in tattered clothes, his face weathered by life on the streets. He sat on the curb, a cardboard sign reading "Anything Helps" propped beside him. His name was Thomas, though Margaret didn't know it yet. He had seen her leave, her shoulders hunched, her dignity bruised. Without a word, he stood, walked to the diner's door, and slipped inside. Margaret assumed he was seeking warmth, but moments later, he returned, holding a receipt. "I paid for your meal," he said softly, his voice rough but kind. Margaret blinked, stunned. "Why?" she whispered. Thomas shrugged, a faint smile breaking through his grizzled beard. "Because I know what it's like to be invisible." Margaret hesitated, then followed him back inside. The manager, flustered, handed her the soup and bread, muttering about no more trouble. As they sat together, Margaret learned Thomas's story. He had once been a mechanic, a husband, a father, but a factory closure, a string of bad luck, and a battle with grief had left him homeless. Yet, in his pocket, he carried a few crumpled bills, earnings from a day of begging, and he'd chosen to spend them on her. Their conversation stretched late into the night. Margaret shared her own struggles, the loss of her husband, the children who had moved far away, the loneliness that clung to her like a shadow. Thomas listened, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding only hardship could forge. For the first time in years, Margaret felt seen. Not as a burden, not as an old woman, but as a person with a story worth hearing. Word of Thomas's act spread. A young couple at a nearby table overheard and quietly paid for their drinks. A truck driver left an extra tip, instructing the waitress to cover their next meal. By the time Margaret and Thomas left the diner, a small crowd had gathered outside, not to gawk, but to help. A local shelter volunteer offered Thomas a bed for the night. A woman who owned a nearby bakery slipped Margaret a card, promising a job as a cashier if she wanted it. The city, so often cold and indifferent, seemed to pause, stirred by a single act of compassion. Days turned to weeks. Margaret took the bakery job, her hands steady as she rang up customers, her smile brighter than it had been in years. Thomas, with help from the shelter, found work as a handyman, his skills slowly rebuilding his life. They met often, sharing coffee at the same diner, now a place of warmth rather than shame. The manager, humbled by the community's response, started a pay-it-forward board where patrons could cover meals for those in need. Margaret and Thomas never forgot that night. It wasn't just about a meal. It was about being seen, about reminding a world that moved too fast that kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. Margaret kept a photo of them together, taken by a kind stranger outside the diner, on her small apartment's wall. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, a spark of humanity could light the way. What happened next? A city learned to look closer, to see the stories behind the faces it passed by. And 2 strangers, bound by a single act of grace, showed that no one is ever truly alone.